Welcome to the DE Talk podcast. Tune in for dialogue between HR experts to amp up your HR strategies. Don't worry, we'll mix in a few laughs as we know you need it. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues, employers around the globe will soon face new challenges. Will they require employees to be vaccinated? While many are encouraging their workers to get vaccinated, relatively few workplaces are making shots a requirement of employment. To get down to the legal nitty-gritty, we sat down with employment law expert Jay Wang of Fox, Wang & Morgan to provide guidance on vaccine mandates, the recent FDA approval, and what this means for employers and employees around the nation. Ever since COVID-19 vaccines became widely available to the masses, the great debate whether vaccine mandates would be coming to the workplace has taken place in boardrooms, Zoom rooms, and newsrooms alike. For employers, the pandemic has introduced a whole new level of confusion related to what can be required, what cannot, what other like industries are doing, and more. News reports of vaccine passports, requirements, and continuing mask mandates remain hot topics, and much gray area exists as employers grapple with the next hurdle: to require COVID-19 vaccination as a condition of employment or not. With the recent FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine, how will the landscape continue to shift, and what vaccination requirements will begin to take shape? To answer these questions and more, I welcome employment law expert Jay Wang, partner in the California-based firm of Fox, Wang & Morgan, to the DE Talk podcast. Jay specializes in employment litigation that includes civil claims involving wrongful termination, harassment, unpaid wages, discrimination, trade secrets, and workplace violence claims, and also counsels clients as to human resources issues ranging from family leave practices, workplace investigations, and disciplinary write-ups. And we could not think of a better person to have join us today, as he has provided much COVID-19 guidance and information to our own operations team at Direct Employers. Welcome, Jay. It's great to have you join us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're very happy to include you today. But before we get started, can you just share a little bit about your background with us?
Sure. I've now been practicing law for, I think about how long it's been. It's a little surprising, but 22 years.
Oh, wow.
Graduating from Georgetown Law School in 1999. I've done employment law, specifically employment defense law, advising corporations, employers, as to HR policies and defending them in litigation since 2004. So I've spent about 17 years now doing employment law. And I got to say, 2020 and 2021 sort of has reoriented a lot of us employment lawyers into a whole new area we never thought we'd be exposed to.
Oh, I know. I gave a webinar yesterday, and I was literally talking about accommodation requests. And we're getting, everyone I know in the, employment world is getting more of those than we've ever seen before, and we're hearing about religious accommodations, and, it goes down the way. I mean, it just seems like there's so much more today than we've seen ever. And I've been in my field of human resources for, 35 years. So I know what you mean. To that point, you've become somewhat of a subject matter expert for your clients on COVID-19 regulations and requirements and mandates and all of that. Was this a topic that you just naturally gravitated to, or is it something you find interesting, or how did that all happen?
Well, honestly, I don't think any employment lawyer could have known that this was something that we were going to gravitate to. It's sort of, no one would have suspected a worldwide pandemic.
You're
occurring.
Exactly right.
But given what has occurred, it's sort of been the area of specialty for any employment lawyer. If you're an employment defense lawyer and you've not addressed a return to work issue or safety precautions in the workplace issue, accommodations, which we'll talk about later a little bit, or even COVID vaccine mandates, as this podcast is about, then you've kind of missed the boat. I don't know where you've been.
Exactly.
So the result of the pandemic has really made all employment lawyers sort of experts and geared us more toward this subject area.
Yeah, something that none of us really ever wanted to have to face. I know for sure. So, so looking back at 2020, and I think the date March 13th, 2020, when we first went remote, and I think almost every one of our members did as well. And fast forwarding to today, what do you think has been the most surprising element that you've seen unfold related to COVID-19 in the employment situation?
Well, there's really four things I think that really surprised me. Generally, the first thing is I think the lack of understanding. It's kind of interesting that a lot of people and even some employers had no idea that they had an ability to impose vaccine mandates, and that's the operational procedure or policy that can be mandated or can be put into place with the certain caveats and the appropriate protections. But it's sort of new to employers. It's a little surprising that was not well known. And the other second thing is the general misunderstanding of HIPAA. I've seen a lot of calls to about HIPAA, and you can't ask me whether I've been vaccinated. You can't ask if I have had COVID or the symptoms, and just a general misunderstanding of HIPAA and how it applies. The third thing I would say is the uniqueness of the labor market in this pandemic. What we've seen is that employees have taken control over their own future and are more willing to change jobs, change careers without a backup necessarily in the pocket. That they've kind of taken more ownership over their control. I don't know if it's just because of the catastrophic nature of the pandemic has made people kind of realize, carpe diem, seizing the day,
right,
or what. But that sort of willingness to step away is one of those issues that employers face when they start thinking about mandates. About, I've already got issues about a workforce labor shortage when we have over 10 million jobs, I think, in the last report available. And even though we only have 6 million unemployed, those jobs aren't getting filled. And
right.
That last thing I need is more employees walking away. The last thing, and this is from a bipartisan point of view, that's really been surprising is what I perceive to be poor messaging from the federal agencies under both administrations, under both President Trump and President Biden. I feel there's been a lot of what's the right word, but a lot of
misinformation for one thing.
Yeah, misinformation, a lot of lack of clarity that
That's
I think
would have
that would have gone a long way toward assuaging a lot of fears about the vaccine or about lockdowns or things like that. I think the messaging could have been better. I follow Dr. Scott Gottlieb on Twitter, and I'm actually about to get his book, who used to be the head of the FDA under Trump, but left in 2019 before the pandemic. I'm very excited to read his book. I think it'll be very interesting. His perception of how the U.S. handled the COVID pandemic and plans or suggestions for how to, in the future, ensure we don't have the same situation arise, whether any other global catastrophe occurs in regards to pandemics.
Well, what's really scary is they're saying that, this isn't going to be the only one. They keep talking about the next pandemic. You just sit here and I jokingly say around here that face palm emoji is my favorite one. And every time I think about another pandemic, I see myself, putting my hand in my face, going, oh, geez, not again. I think this really did bring a lot of, opinions and things to the surface that people didn't normally argue about, and the vaccination requirements or mandates, or I think it's creating so much dissension across the business world, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about some things, but I think that's been a real challenge for everybody. So talking about stances on vaccines, there's been employers all across the nation, and they have, they've all taken various stances. some are making a vaccine a condition of employment, and that was kind of interesting. I had one of our members say, how can I put this in a job description? And some are strongly encouraging. We have monthly staff meetings, and I literally said, I'm begging you. It's like I'm not mandating it, but I'm begging you to get a vaccine. But some companies are suggesting that, kind of like me, that you get a vaccine, but they're not making that a requirement. There's companies like Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, I think Walmart and other companies. They have now mandated that all workers must get vaccinated or share their vaccination status before they return to the office. And then others, like General Electric, have said, they're not going to make those requirements because they don't want to complicate global operations. Some are saying you have to have a negative test. It's going to be interesting, but I think all employers, and you kind of hinted at this, think about the legal minefield that they're going to find themselves in. So let's just start here on I'm going to give you a series of questions. So are COVID-19 vaccination mandates legal? And
generally, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, generally speaking, yes. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine requirements have been supported by regulatory rules, state and federal statutes, and Supreme Court case decisions. I know a lot of people like to cite to Jacobson v. Massachusetts. This is where I'm going to get a little bit into the legalese, and I'll try and keep it as short keep it as succinct as possible. But there is case law as well as regulations related to the right of employers to require vaccination in the workplace. Jacobson was a case where the Supreme Court basically upheld the power of state legislatures to require vaccinations. In 1922, the Supreme Court then ruled on a different case upholding school vaccine mandates. So these mandates have been in place. What you'll see, though, is that the discretion is wider and more available for private employers than it would be in regards to legislation or mandates. I speak about this Jacobson case. I'll talk about it a little bit more when we start talking about what the Biden administration just announced last week in regards to mandating vaccines. But in regards to private employment relationships, there's been great discretion or great leeway provided to private parties in regards to how they manage their relationships, how they determine who they want to work with, who they want to have as an employee and interact with or have represent them. So there's, that leeway has generally existed. Now, to be clear, there are certain caveats you want to make sure are in place, and we'll get to those, I imagine, when we get further into this podcast.
Well, I'll tell you what, in my position, I'll just come right out and tell you the thing that scares me about putting a vaccination mandate in place is losing employees. I don't want to lose people that I know have strong opinions. Some I understand, some I don't, but I don't. That kind of cripples me from making people get their vaccination, and it's a difficult position to be in for any employer. Do you see any particular risk for employers who mandate the vaccinations?
Yeah, so there's three particular risks I've seen in advising clients or hearing, reviewing sort of cases that have come up or issues that have come up. And I think the three issues, the main issues I'm saying, the first one, and to be clear, these are legal issues. The first one is how to determine whether that exemption request is appropriate. Mm-hmm. If the person does have a good faith religious belief, a sincerely held religious belief to request an exemption from the vaccine mandate, or whether they have a medical condition that precludes them from receiving the vaccine.
Now, see,
that's the first issue.
It's interesting because I was on a webinar where they were talking about this with a law firm, and they said that there are really limited religious exemptions, or not, I'm sorry, not religious, medical exemptions. And they said, a lot of times people will say they have allergies, and I literally wrote it down. They said, if you have an allergic reaction to polyethylene glycol, you should get the J&J vaccine because that's not in that particular vaccination. If you have an allergy to polysorbate, then you should get the Pfizer or Moderna vaccination. And, they said there aren't really many medical issues that would prohibit you from getting the vaccination. I have type 1 diabetes and have had it for 36 years, and my doctor said my system would be severely compromised if I didn't get vaccinated. So that's a tough one, I think, because some people just don't have enough knowledge maybe about their newly diagnosed medical situation, so that's a tough one.
So let me address that medical condition issue. That seminar you attended is generally correct. If you look at the CDC website, the CDC in discussing vaccination really only recommends 3 specific health conditions that would preclude vaccination. And what it really only does is delay vaccination. The first one is if a person is receiving monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasma for COVID-19 treatment. In other words, they've already gotten COVID. They're now getting treated for COVID. They suggest don't get the vaccines, but that only delays vaccination for about 90 days is the CDC recommendation. The second instance is people with known COVID-19 exposure, where you may have COVID. You don't want to get the vaccine until you're through your quarantine period and you're through the COVID exposure concern, the possibility that you might have COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And the third one, which I think you addressed at the seminar, was severe allergic reaction. Those are the only 3 health conditions the CDC kind of recognizes as, hey, hold off on getting vaccinated. Now, I know some employers, some clients of mine, have taken a more conservative approach because, again, it's, medical conditions, getting a handle on understanding whether a person has a disability or a medical condition, a lot of employers are hesitant about, right? They've got not a clear understanding as how to handle the process or to what they can ask to confirm a medical condition.
Exactly.
So they kind of err on the side of caution. So we've seen employers have, provide exemptions in regards to heart conditions related to Moderna. There was a concern about maybe one of the side effects of Moderna is some myocardial issues that resolve, but that they want to be careful in that regard. I know a lot of pregnant women on a practical basis are avoiding it because they just don't understand whether it has any impact on fetal development of babies in womb, even though the studies show that there's no impact on fetal development from any of these vaccinations.
Or even for breastfeeding moms. My own daughter had a baby, and she was concerned about, nursing her daughter last year, and literally asked the pediatrician and her obstetrician, if there was going to be a concern, and both said no. So she got vaccinated.
Yeah, and that's where the advice and counsel of your treating physician really becomes important. One of the things I kind of stress to my clients when employees come in with these kind of issues is, have them talk to their physicians. It's very clear it's a very limited amount of medical conditions that preclude vaccination. And in regards to precluding vaccination, all it does is delay it. You can get vaccinated subsequently. So the exemptions are very limited with medical conditions. It's sort of the same thing with the religious exemption, just to pivot a little bit, because it is also very limited in regards to who would have a sincerely held religious belief. To my knowledge, I'm only aware of 3 really religious sects that it's documented and well known have an issue with vaccination. One is a Dutch Reformation Church, which I only learned about through research. Christian Scientists, and fundamentalist Muslims. Those are the only ones that really have expressed and put as part of their religious doctrine concern about vaccination. Yeah, so it's also limited in that regard, and that's where employers kind of come in, and it's one of the risks, that deals with this risk about what can I ask to determine the person is actually, has a sincerely held religious belief. How do I confirm this to ensure that they are exempt from having to get vaccinated?
Well, I think that the hardest part for employers is, and you hinted toward this, they don't want to do the wrong thing, but they also don't want to upset their employees, I sit there and think about workers' comp costs, and I know some companies are saying, well, you can't travel on company business if you're not vaccinated, or, just they're coming up with all different types of suggestions, and to your point about HIPAA, I had suggested for a conference that, and I've heard a lot of conferences are doing this, they wear either the lanyards that would be red, yellow, or green, or bracelets, or even for weddings, and the red says, please don't come close to me. The yellow says, well, if I know you, or whatever, and the green says, hey, yeah, come give me a hug, and that sort of thing. And I had one person say, well, that's a HIPAA issue. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's a personal choice. Thank you very much. But, it's just...
that's a HIPAA issue.
So I think it's just one of those things that people are just afraid. We don't want to do the wrong thing. And so they, like you said, err on the side of caution. But what do you think about that recent announcement for the Biden administration about vaccine mandates? Wow. I was joking around. I guess I need to hire about 15 people. So we have to do it, and it's not my requirement.
It's very interesting. So there's it was a 6-point plan that President Biden announced, and for purposes of employment or workforce, the American workforce, there's really 4 main points that really addresses employment. I think what you're going to see is that some of them he has pretty firm legal standing and ground on. Some are a little more questionable, and one that I think is going to be very interesting test case. So in regards to his proposals, his mandate in regards to federal employees having to get vaccinated, and there will be no exception for opting out to be tested to opt out, would probably be legal. Imagine the federal government as a corporation. Biden's the CEO. He's directing what employees he wants in his employment, and that's fine. There's not much of a legal challenge there. I think your organization put out a very good WIR about the legal effects or implications of Biden's proposal to have federal contractor employees be vaccinated. Contractors who work on certain types of contracts with the federal government, their employees having to be vaccinated. His announcement is on less secure legal standing. He needs to go through the regular procedural process through the Administrative Procedures Act.
Yep.
One way.
They got to write it down law.
Exactly. You got to provide notice. You got to allow public comment. But he can get around that. If the agencies just issue emergency mandates in regards to vaccination of contractors, they probably could get around the public notice requirement. The one that I think is most interesting is the big one, the one that private employers are really concerned about, which is President Biden directing OSHA to issue an emergency temporary standard requiring employers of 100 employees or more require vaccination, or alternatively require testing every week on at least a weekly basis to opt out of vaccination.
Yeah.
So the reason that's interesting, and I'll try not to get too much into sort of the legal issues that just fascinate me as a lawyer, but basically what he's doing is using the emergency standard that OSHA allows. The problem employers face when they yell, this is unconstitutional, is the fact that OSHA has very broad powers. Congress authorized OSHA some very broad powers, and under the emergency temporary standards, those powers are even broader. I think, if I recall correctly, the standard is that they only have to show that there's a grave danger to employees One, and two, that such emergency standard is necessary to protect employees from that danger. Well, no one can dispute that COVID-19 is a danger.
Exactly.
Where we get into sort of the interesting legal arguments is, one, you're going to need a smart lawyer to basically come in and say, listen, Congress didn't have authority to delegate that power to OSHA. It's the non-delegation doctrine. That's too expansive. Congress is supposed to be making laws. And secondly, the other argument is courts need to not follow the Chevron doctrine. The Chevron doctrine basically says that courts, if Congress has not made a direct law on an issue, an administrative agency proposes or pushes out a regulation, courts should show deference to the administrative rule. So it's interesting from my viewpoint as a constitutional scholar, as a side interest, to know if someone's going to now argue to remove the Chevron doctrine. The one caveat I will say about emergency temporary standards from OSHA, OSHA has issued, if I remember correctly, 10 emergency temporary standards since 1971. 7 of them have been challenged. Of those 7, 5 have been stayed or vacated. So OSHA doesn't have a very good standing, a very good record in regards to enforcing their emergency temporary standards. So that's where I see you're going to see the legal challenges, especially from big organizations that represent groups of employers to challenge that rule.
Wow. What do you think? What guidance are you giving to your clients that are asking you, gosh, what does this mean? Does this mean we have to have everybody vaccinated? What are we going to do? What guidance are you giving, Jay?
So honestly, outside of the Biden administration's proposals, purely from talking with my clients as private employers, those who want to provide vaccinations or require vaccinations, which I recommend. I think it's perfectly legal, and that's our goal, to get past this pandemic. I recommend the vaccine mandates, provided you put in the appropriate exemptions. And more importantly, there's really 5 things I think I tell my clients. The first thing is, don't take an all or nothing approach. Don't say you either get vaccinated or you're getting terminated. Provide the alternative, the opt-out possibility, whether that's weekly testing. There's issues related to that we'll get into, or offer the incentives to the employment. Again, other issues arise from there, but don't offer the all or nothing approach. 2, know your workforce. What's palatable to the largest majority of your employees? Get an understanding of where your employees are on this. What's going to work in California is not going to work in Tennessee. That it's not going to work in Montana. It's just different standards. So understand your workforce. Understand what they're going to be comfortable with. Additionally, when you are implementing the vaccination policies, try the carrot before the stick. What we've seen is employers have tried many different ways to encourage vaccination. They've used carrots and they've used sticks. And more and more we're seeing now that the sticks are being used because the carrots don't seem to have the impact that the employers want. But start there. Start with the sticks. Start with the incentives, with the gift cards or the bonuses that are more encouraging. And then finally, provide notice. Keep your employees informed. Keep the communication open. Start even before, if this is dealing with returning to work, before they return to work, give them warning. Let them know what your thinking is. Allow Q&A sessions with your company. Allow questions. Have someone dedicated to answer those questions. Help them understand why you're going the way you are. But provide that notice, provide them the warning, and encourage them in such a way that, like you've pointed out, Candy, there's a concern about losing employees, and you want to do this in a way such that you don't want to deter employees from returning to work. You don't want them to go off and find other employment. But, you have that counterbalance. You have employees, and I've heard these situations, who are unwilling to come back unless there's vaccine mandates. They don't want to work with individuals who are unvaccinated.
Exactly. I literally read something, I think, last week, and they said that a lot of the people that are really for or are proponents of the vaccine mandates are the vaccinated people, because they don't want to work with unvaccinated people and be placed in an unnecessary risk situation. But I remember thinking, when we were talking about a hybrid work policy, which I've since pushed back to even bringing some people back to work a few days a week or something, and I didn't want to lose people with that. So I don't want us to be 100% remote, but I don't want to require everybody to come back 5 days a week, because I know I could very easily lose some people, and we're being successful as we are, and I think, it's the same type of decision-making process that every leader is going through, and you want to do the right thing, but you also, and I've made it very obvious with my employees, is that safety is first. Safety is first. We've seen people, we've seen loved ones, get sick. We've seen loved ones die, and I wouldn't put that, I wouldn't want that for anyone else. And so it's been a real challenge. I think this is something that, as we said at the very beginning of the podcast, people that are working today have never experienced this before. We've had smallpox, but that's really been prior generations that had to deal with that, and we've all learned about what they went through, but we haven't faced it ourselves. So,
and very briefly, let me just point out that's one of my concerns about the Biden administration's announcement last week. The messaging about getting vaccinated really only appeals to those who are already vaccinated. Once you impose a government-issued mandate, that just what I've seen is it hardens the position of those who don't want to get vaccinated. Hey, don't tell me what to do.
It's an interesting
sort of thing. And what we were seeing before the announcement is, one, a downturn on the Delta variant, small downturn, but a downturn a little bit, and actually increased numbers in vaccinations before Biden's announcement. That the vaccination numbers were getting higher and higher, and a lot of that had to do with private employers or private relationships resulting in vaccinations, or seeing what has occurred with the Delta variant. I thought we were on the right path toward getting vaccinated, and my concern about the mandates that President Biden issued is it's going to steal the fortitude of those who just don't want to get vaccinated, now saying, well, why is the government pushing it?
That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't actually thought of that, but that really is interesting to think about. So let's talk a little bit about some of the requirements or ideas that companies are putting into place, like Delta Airlines and the mandate. I've also heard, and I know it was Delta that is putting a $200 surcharge, a monthly surcharge on their medical benefits. What do you think about some of these? Are they legal, or are they good ideas? What's your thought?
So let me start sort of from the most lenient in regards to not requiring vaccination to the most stringent in terms of vaccine mandates and what I've seen across the spectrum. You start with those companies who are not putting in any vaccine mandates, making no request about vaccination. That is becoming smaller and smaller. I don't see as many employers, unless you're, like I said, in certain states that are very vociferous about not having those kind of mandates in place. But those are smaller and smaller, and more importantly, even if you have no vaccine mandate, well, that means you're going to have to impose sort of all the social distancing, masking, temperature checks that we had at the start of this pandemic.
We're still doing that.
Exactly. Then we go sort of closer, sort of using the carrot. Hey, we're requesting you get vaccinated. If you get vaccinated, I'm going to offer you, a gift card or a bonus or extra PTO, things like that.
I don't
so
really
that's
like
all
that.
permitted. Yeah, well, a lot of people don't like it, but it's the thing that there's clear definition on, because the EEOC on May 28th, when they issued and updated their COVID-19 guidance, made it clear that's permissible.
Oh,
so
I know.
Offer, those incentives, and that's where employers are saying, well, I've got a guidance from EEOC. I know I can do this.
But you know what, Jay?
Let's go there.
Yeah, but you know what, Jay, on my thought, or what my thought is on that, is that what about all the people that were taking the position early on that, you know what, they recommend we get this vaccine, I really should probably get it, and they do. They didn't get any benefit, you know.
They didn't get any benefit.
Yeah, so that's something that bothers
Well,
me.
the message, you know, there's that concern. The messaging I always tell my clients who raise that issue is, think of it this way. The way you encourage them is, the benefit is you are now no longer working with someone who's
I know.
I knew that was... That's the benefit to you. But,
I knew that was coming, Jay. I could and you're right. And you're right. I get that, but it's unfortunate that it takes that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but you've seen companies like Trader Joe's, Aldi, Amtrak offer those kind of programs, incentive programs to reward vaccination. The one caveat I want to put in place to any listener who's thinking about that is the permissibility of those incentives lessen if the employer itself is administering those vaccination programs. So the three things I caution is, make the reward small. You know, the larger it gets, you don't want to make it seem like you're coercing someone into vaccination, which is
that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
If you offer a car, it's coercion.
Hey, I do about anything.
Gift card. Yeah. Offering time off for vaccination is a safer bet than cash stipend. Time off is easier to administer and handle. And if a financial incentive is offered, you know, you have to find alternatives to the incentive for those who have religious beliefs or medical exemptions.
Exactly.
Because if you treat them differently, that's the grounds for a discrimination claim.
Yeah,
then we go sort of, from there we go into sort of the sticks, you know, where people start saying, listen, we need a mandate. Now we're going to, quote unquote, punish you. For example, the one that I'm recommending the most is, you know, if you're going to have a mandate, then imposing work restrictions on unvaccinated, mask requirements, testing, limits on interaction, those sorts of things. Again, being careful about those who have true exemptions and that it's not altering the terms and conditions of their employment, because then you're talking about discrimination issues.
Exactly.
The next one down is, as you mentioned, Candy, sort of financial burdens, imposing financial burdens like Delta did with their $200 increase on the monthly medical premium costs for unvaccinated. You know, those are permitted. There's legal precedent on that. There's surcharges for employers sometimes impose on smokers as part of their wellness program. But you know, you run into a lot of regulatory issues. It's very, to administer, you need to worry about HIPAA, you need to worry about ERISA, you need to worry about the Affordable Care Act, you need to worry about the GINA. These are all acts you have to be aware of and ensure that whatever you're putting in place complies with all those laws.
But you know,
it's difficult.
Yeah, well, but I think what the unvaccinated folks don't think about, and I mentioned it at the top of the podcast, if you're traveling on company business and you get infected, well, the company has to cover that because it's a workers' comp issue. And, you know, you're on company business. If you get sick or you die and you're on the company's medical coverage, that contributes to their experience rating for next year's premiums. You know, and I don't think people are thinking that far into the process. But, you know, I keep preaching about safety, you know, but there's a lot of people in a lot of companies that, I mean, you can see it. You know, I mean, I watch people walk around unmasked all the time. And, you know, yeah, I'm vaccinated, but I still wear my mask just because I don't want to get the Delta variant. And, you know, it's just one of those things that, I mean, obviously I'm in a position where I have to think about costs, but I don't think a lot of employees, you know, they pay their medical premium, they go to work, they do, you know, they don't think about the organizational costs.
No, from a practical viewpoint, I think it's very rare that an employee thinks of the employer's cost when it comes to issues that arise for them individually. But, you know, that was the reasoning by Delta. They said, you know, we got to put in this $200 surcharge because if anyone gets COVID, treatment's about $50,000.
Exactly.
That our medical insurance has to cover. So we got to, you know, be concerned about that.
Exactly.
I think the furthest stick you're going to see is those who say, "Listen, either you get vaccinated or you're getting terminated." That's not a that's the all or nothing approach I try and dissuade my clients from taking.
That's not a good move.
No, it's not a great one. It's one that, though, you will see arise from more healthcare settings, right? Situations where you're taking care of immunocompromised patients or customers, and that's the concern. And so healthcare mandates are a little different than what you'll see for private employers not in the healthcare field.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was very pleased on August 23rd, 2021, when the FDA approved Pfizer's vaccine, and now I heard the other day that they're expecting to have the vaccine approved for children as young as 5 years of age. And I can't remember if they said by Halloween or by Thanksgiving, but I've heard people say, my kid's going to be first in line. They want to get their kids vaccinated. Do you think that this has changed employers' attitudes, or even the unvaccinated folks, their attitudes about, okay, well, this vaccination must be safe now, maybe I should get it? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, in the reasons I've seen, I'm not sure employer hesitancy to the vaccine mandates was because of the fact the vaccines had only been granted under an emergency use authorization by the FDA. I just don't see that from. I mean, it may be a reason. It's not the most prevalent reason. I think the reasons I saw employer hesitancy in regards to vaccine mandates had more to do with, being cautious in your approach. One, seeing what other businesses in your industry are doing. What's the approach they're taking? Two, waiting to determine the efficacy and potential risks associated with vaccination.
I think that's what it was.
Now we're a little further along. We can see 178 million have gotten the vaccine. There's been no death, and that goes toward messaging. A lot of people seem to think there have been deaths or from getting the vaccine. That's a messaging issue. Taking a softer approach to start. A lot of employers just requested vaccines to start. Again, not wanting to push people to leave their workforce. I think those have been bigger considerations than whether the emergency use authorization or whether the vaccine's been fully approved. When it comes to employees, the reasons for non-vaccination are so varied. I think it does affect a small number of the population, but I've also seen surveys from SHRM where 28% of employees have said they're not getting vaccinated regardless of whether an employer mandates it or not. They'll just leave their job. So I don't know. I think the full approval by the FDA as to Pfizer changed some minds, but not to as large an extent as we would have hoped.
I think you're right on that. I tend to agree with you on that. What do you think about all of the vaccine requirements that vary from state to state? I know one of our employees went to a school board meeting and said, what a nightmare, and trying to get masks approved for children. I mean, it's school district by school district, it's state by state. What do you think about it, and what do you think people should do to figure out what their state is requiring?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of, people are getting over inundated with information. Some of it true, some of it false. But it's sort of sensationalized in regards to what the actual mandates are, and what all these videos we're seeing from school board meetings of parents just being absolutely angry over mask mandates, and other parents being absolutely angry that there aren't mask mandates. Politicians who held off on mask mandates get called the worst names, some really bad names. But trying to cut through the noise. Let's understand, when it comes to outright bans on private employer vaccine mandates, at this stage, only 2 states have expressly forbidden private employers from mandating vaccines: Montana and North Dakota.
That aren't even that heavily populated, or they're that's interesting.
Yeah. Now that changes when it comes to state worker mandates. Okay. To those listeners who are state workers who work for a government entity, There's 19 states that have vaccine mandates for state workers. In other words, you have to be vaccinated. But there are still 7 states that say, we're not going to put any kind of mandate, and in fact ban certain forms of mandates in regards to state workers, whether it's prohibiting the requirement of showing proof of vaccination, as in Indiana or Texas, or prohibiting public employers from requiring vaccination as a condition of employment, which occurs in Utah and Tennessee. But that's with state employees. Like I said, when it comes to private employers, there's really only 2 states that have precluded or explicitly said, you're not allowed to have mandates on your employees.
Which is interesting because, it's so, everything's so vocal in the political world, but it seems like, some of the states that are led by Republican governors, although Indiana is, and they've been pretty careful, I think, about what they say and what they require. But Montana is a Democratic, or you know what? No, that's a Republican state now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a Republican state, but Montana is also the only state that doesn't have at will employment. They're very unique when it comes to
that's the
employment laws. Yeah.
Okay.
So that goes in that regard. And one of the things we need to clarify is about these these mandates. The big news is always about Governor Abbott in Texas or Governor DeSantis in Florida. And what they've kind of said is, listen, you cannot impose mandates, mask mandates, but that doesn't prevent a parent from making that choice.
That's what I keep thinking. Yep.
Yeah, and what it's sort of a different philosophy. Whether it's a good philosophy or not, it's not for me to say. But what we're seeing in California, New York, the more liberal states is we're going to tell you got to have a mandate because we want to make sure there's a law that make sure you do it. And what Texas and Florida is saying is, listen, we're not going to make the law. And it's not our position for the government to tell you what to do. But that doesn't prevent you from doing it. You can still wear your mask. You can still take your shots. It's just not us directing you to do it. You should be doing it on your own.
Right.
And it's interesting because both Abbott and DeSantis are vaccinated. And they've both encouraged vaccination. They're not anti-vaxxers. Governor DeSantis rolled out a very good vaccination program in Florida. Mm-hmm. But he's just saying, listen, I'm not going to be the one who mandates you get vaccinated.
Well, and I think that's, bottom line, I think this is ridiculous if people try to make it a partisan issue because getting vaccinated, staying healthy is truly a bipartisan issue at the highest degree. So.
Well, I think that goes to the issue of, there's been some mixed messaging that should have been clear. Yeah. For example, when Johnson & Johnson, we had those 6 cases of women over 50 developing some thrombosis from taking the vaccine, the federal government put an immediate pause.
Exactly.
Now, whether that was good or not, what you see in reality is those people who took the Johnson & Johnson shots or people who took Johnson & Johnson shots fell off drastically after that pause.
I know.
Johnson & Johnson has not been used as much.
As readily.
And that pause did a lot of damage when you realize this is, it's an understanding of risk and what the statistics are. 6 out of a million is still very low percentage. It's less than, I think I saw certain studies, you have a greater possibility of developing this condition from taking birth control if you were female than getting the vaccination. So, it's messaging issues.
Yeah, and I think that's
the same thing with the reporting, the website the federal government runs in regards to reporting injuries or deaths following vaccination. The website has the caveat, no one reads it, and I felt they should have been clear about it, that there's no correlation. It's not deaths or injuries caused by the vaccine. It's just deaths and injuries that occurred after someone got vaccinated. So it could have been from something else entirely. But people have been using that website to say, hey, the vaccinations are killing people, and that's not the case.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Jay, and it's probably a good point to leave everyone with. But let me just ask you one more thing. We've covered so much information. Is there anything else that you think employers need to be aware of, or any cautions that they need to take related to COVID-19 or vaccination requirements, or do you think we've covered that?
Yeah, there's two things I think employers should be aware of coming forward. We are now seeing laws being passed in certain states where if a person loses their employment because they've not been vaccinated, they will be entitled to unemployment benefits. It's unclear whether they be entitled, but 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and I believe Tennessee, have introduced legislation saying if you lose your job because you refuse to take the vaccine, you're entitled to unemployment.
Okay.
And then the other caveat in regards to everything we've been saying is in regards to a private employer, if you have a unionized workforce, there are different issues you need to confront in regards to collective bargaining, engaging with the union in regards to establishing new policies related to vaccination.
Oh boy, it's never ending. Go ahead.
I do have one other thing I realized I didn't hit on. Payment. How employers pay for time off or vaccination or illness or side effects resulting from vaccination. Understand that President Biden has kind of mandated through the OSHA emergency temporary standard that employers are going to have to pay for that time off. Understand outside of the OSHA rule, state laws are probably going to require employer payment, especially if the vaccination is instrumental to the performance of duties. So this is going to be a case-by-case basis, really about what job duty the individual has. But if they are customer-facing, retail, it's more likely that the vaccination is necessary for the performance of their job.
Right. Yeah.
You as the employer is going to have to pay for the time off to get vaccinated, or if they get sick, have side effects, you're going to have to pay for that time off. All of that you need to understand compensation issues related to vaccination.
So you left me with a good point to make, and that is something that I recommend to our members on a daily basis. And that's when you're trying to figure out what the next step is, always make sure that you include your legal counsel and follow what they recommend, because they're the ones that are the experts about it, certainly not us in HR. No matter how much
I'll give you 2 resources. One is the EEOC guidance on COVID-19. Obviously, stay up to date with that. And then there is a website, www.nashp.org, which is the website for the National Academy for State Health Policy.
Oh.
They have an interactive map that shows mandates by state.
Oh, that's great.
And provide a little bit of information, sort of the superficial information about the laws in each state related to private employer mandates, state worker mandates, health worker mandates, vaccine passports. So that is a starting point to kind of keep you up to date on what the law is in your particular state. And then if you need further clarification on what the law actually says, speak to your counsel.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful, Jay. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jay, for all of your information. I'll tell you what, I learned a lot, and I thought I knew quite a bit about this, but I truly mean that. I learned a lot this morning. We like to end every podcast, though, with 5 rapid-fire questions. So I'm going to give you a topic or a question, and I want you to say the first thing that comes to mind. So are you ready?
Yep.
All right. Technology savant or a Luddite?
Oh, I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to know what TikTok is.
So you're kind of halfway in between.
Yeah, I'm like any Gen Xer. We're right in the middle.
All right. Books or movies?
Both. I actually I have a voracious appetite for knowledge or information or entertainment. The problem with being a lawyer is there's not a lot of time to read because you read for your job. But I anything I can get my hands on, I will read or watch.
All right. Well, it sounds like my daughter. Actually, she's one of my daughters is an attorney, and my other daughter is in the Doctor of Physical Therapy program, and so she's having to read a lot. My older daughter has always loved to read and had to read in law school, and she doesn't read quite as much anymore, but she's now a mom too, so it's like I get it. She doesn't have that much time. Okay, advice you've received that still resonates with you today.
From my mom, who passed away 10 years ago. said, be yourself. Always be yourself. That's really all that matters. If you're true to yourself, whether people like you, whether people hate you, it doesn't matter. Just be true to who you are.
That's great advice. I like that. Favorite sports team?
Well, there's a few of them. Atlanta Braves for baseball, the San Francisco 49ers for football, and San Jose Sharks for hockey.
Okay, I'll go with the Sharks, but I'm a Colts and a Cubbies fan. Okay, as an attorney, caffeine has to be your best friend. Coffee or tea?
I'm going to have to say tea, even though I'm not a big fan of tea, because I actually don't drink coffee. Really? I am one of the few attorneys who don't drink coffee, and I often wonder how I survived law school.
I do too. I do too, because like I said, my daughter's an attorney, and I know what she went through, so I don't know how you did it. Yeah. But all right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Jay, and sharing your knowledge and your insight on this very important topic. You know, with so many unexpected challenges that we talked about earlier that have been thrown at employers over the last year and a half, it's certainly something that requires special attention and careful consideration in businesses, both large and small. And if our listeners would like to connect with you, what is the best way that they can get in touch?
My email address is jwang@foxwangmorgan.com. Our law firm website is www.foxwangmorgan.com.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of the DE Talk podcast. Stay connected with direct employers on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and subscribe to our emails by visiting directemployers.org/subscribe to receive notifications of new episodes each month.